Welcome to today's episode of Cascading Leadership. I am your friendly neighborhood talent strategy nerd. I always make LB laugh when I say this, Dr. Jim. And with me, I have my illustrious co-host who's got like an Iliad and Odyssey version title.
I am Lawrence Brown, otherwise known as LB, your executive reading and research coach.
Hello, LB.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. So we are in for an action-packed show, and our featured guest, and I'll introduce her in a second, is going to teach us a lot about creating an evergreen content flywheel. So when we're thinking about what does that even mean, that's what we're going to talk about in this show. So in this episode, we're going to learn about how to effectively distribute content, how to effectively repurpose content, and then how to build, and this might be actually the most important takeaway that we're going to get out of it, or learning that we're going to get out of it, how to build a personal, professional point of view and brand. So to teach us about all of this stuff is one of my favorite Canadian Desi's. That's a title right there. Welcome to the show, Susan.
Thank you for having me, gentlemen. This is awesome. My name is Susan Diaz, and I run a podcasting firm called C+P Digital in Toronto. And we work with membership organizations who have like multiple stakeholders and a lot of levels of communicators to bring them together, because podcasting is a great way to do that. That is the hill that I would die on. Mostly because at this time in history, it's like probably where the least amount of clutter is. And it's a way to put some roots or some structure or some system into the marketing, which is like relatively lower effort compared to mediums like video or like intensive writing. So that's us. That said, content marketing is the key thing that we offer. Big fan of the idea that blogs should be taken out of just writing into multi-format, because I think we're at that time where we're done with it. Not to say that you don't need the blogs, of course you do. So we bring it all together. Once you're creating a podcast, are you fully and completely getting everything you can out of it? And I know that I'm preaching to people who fully get that, watching the way that you folks roll out your podcast. So that's exactly what we aim to do. So we're a team of 7 people, and that's our day job. The other part of who I am is I'm a mom. I am the mom of a 10-year-old. She's wicked smart. She's the reason why I've learned over years to like super simplify something, because, you know, if you can speak to a kid and get them to see something, it's really useful as a writer. She's up in the metaverse and gaming all the time, and I'm learning every day from her.
Susan, I'm super pumped to have you on the show. I want to pick up on a couple of things before we dive into the meat of the conversation. So you mentioned podcasting specifically as one of the mediums that you operate in. Now, I don't know if the audience is aware, but you actually for a period of time had one of the top rated podcasts in Canada. So that's pretty important. So tell us a little bit about how you got into podcasting as a medium and why you decided to make that pivot.
Such a good question. Okay, so why podcasting? Because we were facing some of the issues that many people were facing, which was that the writing space was pretty saturated. And this was like, 4 years ago, when like you put lead magnets out there and people were just nobody wanted to give you their email to get down that strategy. So we were like, we need to do it ourselves, because I learn by doing. And so does the rest of the team that we work with. And we're like, we just need to try something new. So we did videos that did well. We got a couple projects where we went in with all kinds of introductions about ourselves. And their introduction was, hey, this is Susan, and she makes a video series. So I really started to think about what people were impressed by versus what we thought qualifications was what we were paying attention to. So at that point, it was my partner in the business, Will, who was like, Susan, we need to make a podcast. And my answer was, no, we don't. We just have too much going on right now. And I don't like the sound of my voice. I'm an immigrant. People won't understand me. Like all of the imposter syndrome pieces that you can think about just came out to play. But he was pretty visionary about it. And he was like, let's just do it. Let's do like a test. Let's do a pilot. And then we did. And I have to say, I fell in love with it. It's just so freeing, and just get together, have a discussion. In the beginning, we thought that nobody would come to the table. Like we were going to beg all of our friends in marketing to show up and talk about what keeps them up at night. And we did for about 2 or 3 episodes. But after that, we pretty much never had to search hard for a guest. Somebody was always happy to come on. So we did 100 We're at 172 now, and it's had a few avatar changes. But about a season into it, like less than 10 episodes, an existing client said, "Do you make podcasts for other people?" And I said, "I do now."
Yeah.
My mama didn't raise any stupid children.
No doubt.
And then the pandemic came up. So we had to take some serious decisions at that point, because while we didn't lose any clients, and over the years, we've gotten to a place where we've made our business model a bit more like monthly recurring revenue, and you've got like a way in which you're not going to be like left in the cold if you don't have some projects. That said, it was a hard couple of years, not least of which because I'm a parent. I had to like school a child from home. All of that fed in, and the niching into podcasting happened at that point. We had to choose, like, what, you can't be all things to all people. So who do we want to really serve? And in some ways, where does our zone of genius lie? And I think that was when we said, like, yes, we could help people in this way, but we are probably best off helping people with their podcasts. And I want to say that was a one-day decision. It wasn't. It took me like 9 to 12 months to fully dig into that and be like, this is it. This is all we do. Like, even a small example, if I may, gentlemen, like just changing my bio from digital marketing founder to like podcast founder, like it's a little fear-inducing, but it went well.
I know in the beginning of the show, I introduced like 3 key learnings, but just in your description of that journey, there's another 3 things that came out. So one, there's the element of, hey, we think we know what people are looking for, but you actually responded to what the customer wanted. It's what the customer wants is what's primary that should drive your business decisioning in terms of where your particular path goes. And I think that's a key takeaway for small to medium-sized businesses, to be super oriented towards the customer point of view and what the customer is saying is important to them. Deliver your services and deliver your value the way that they're actually consuming it. So that's one. The other thing that is interesting about your podcasting story is that from a learning and development perspective, you started out on the video front, which actually has application here too. And then you made a pivot into podcasting, but both of those things have something in common, because when you look at how people learn and the nature of learning these days, it's on demand. You have to deliver your value statements, your about you, your key learnings in a way that allows people to consume it when it's convenient for them. So that was another key takeaway that I got from your story, is that you're making this pivot in terms of, okay, how can we have our learnings be evergreen out in the world of work? And that seems to be a pretty important takeaway for owners to understand. And then the last thing that you just mentioned is you had to figure out your niche. You know, you can't be all things to all people. And I know that we haven't even gotten to your personal journey and all that sort of stuff, and we're going to get to it. But I had to interject that when you're looking at, okay, how do you grow effectively? How do you grow rapidly? You have to identify the niche that you have to serve. So I want to just call that out, because those are phenomenal points in the course of your journey that you flesh out for the audience. So with all that being said, let's dive into the story of Susan. And we're going to do a little bit of hero story on you, Susan. And I don't care if you're not a fan of the hero journey or any of that. We're just going to do it because that's how we roll. Let's wind it all back. One of the things that you just mentioned was I didn't want to do a podcast because I have an accent and people won't understand me and all that sort of stuff. So share with the class the origin story of Susan Diaz.
Yeah, it's interesting. My parents were big adventurers. They were travelers. I was born in Chennai, and then we lived in Tanzania for a good amount of my formative years. My dad used to work for Coca-Cola and like this big production plant. So it was like in a tiny place on the border of Uganda. And we used to go and illegally grocery shop in Uganda because you didn't get like supplies necessarily the way, like, so if you wanted things like protein and double bubble and all of those things, you didn't get them at that point. So we would do stuff like this. I think adventure was just in my upbringing. Like my parents did it, but why wouldn't we? My husband was a kid who was raised with Air Force background, so they moved around a lot. So as a family, we just travel. So I think for most of my life, we've done that. And then Canada was just like the next step. It's like when you want to return, where's home? So as an adult, like in our like late 20s, we had to make a decision. Is, do you want to go back home, which is India, where we probably haven't been for a very long time, or do you want to go somewhere else? And then that's why we picked and came here, which it's interesting. Sometimes you say you don't want to do something, and then when you actually try it, you love it. Like I was saying to Mithrin, why would I live in the Arctic tundra? No, I don't want to go there. And then we came here and I turned into this evangelist where I'm like, never leaving. This is my home and I've found my people. So that's the backstory, lots and lots of moving around, but I think I might have found a route.
As you talk about finding your route, what was the next phase of your life? Take us through the journey of how you got here today.
I'd say my professionally was what always led my decisions. It was very like, I would start with, what do I not want to do? Which is one of those questions. I don't want, for example, early enough in my life, I don't want to go down the path of being an engineer or being a doctor or whatever, even though my family was very forward thinking and not at all pushing any of us down that path. They did put it in front of us, being like, don't regret it later. If you do want to do this, you can. And I was like, no, that's not what I want to do. So I just followed along with my love of writing. And I just was good at it. It's always helpful. It takes a little while to get to that place where you know it, but it's helpful to notice what comes easy, even if you don't want to call yourself good at it or whatever. Writing came easy to me. A lot of people around me were writers. So I went down that path, but that wasn't like an absolute. Like when I got there, I was like, I hate this. Like, advertising, copywriting is not my thing. And I did stay in advertising and sort of went down a path of, what shall I say, planning and some of that. So I think being a generalist is really what has been an underlying theme in my life. It's like jack of all trades and master of none. I think that's badly said, jack of all trades and master of many, right? And that I think is the sort of future. Can you be an expert at everything? No, but if you can bring things together and get them done, I've taken early enough. If you asked me what my superpower is, I would have said, I see patterns. Like I see patterns that other people don't see. So that's guided my life.
I'm jumping out my chair for those that can't see us, because you had a couple of powerful things, right? So I think that you talked about your superpower, right? And recognizing that. And I think the things that quote unquote come easy to us are really more like gifts, right? And we don't necessarily realize it because we are good at what we do in those particular areas. And the other thing was then, as you were talking about embracing being what I call a multi-potential, someone that is capable of doing a lot of different things. And unfortunately, I agree with you. I think the Renaissance person is a thing of the past and really should not be. And when you described what your journey has been to this point, and even how you got into doing the podcasting, right? It sounds a lot like that. It sounds like being able to make that shift. But something that I wanted to ask you about that you had mentioned, and I don't know how it works in here, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I thought it was a brilliant statement, is the zone of genius. What is that?
That is a concept by an author called Gay Hendricks, and he articulates it as the 4 areas. So you've got a zone
Hold on
of
one sec. So this is how you know that you're in the presence of 2 big ass nerds. As soon as you cited that author and the book,
we both started writing.
Write it down.
So
I absolutely did.
So tell us about. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but like both LB and I just went off
like,
camera and we're writing this down. So
love it.
That's hilarious.
It's a book called The Big Leap. The author is Gay Hendricks, and in it, obviously, there's a fair bit to the book, but the crux of it, which I think really works, especially from a talent perspective and yourself, is these 4 zones he talks about. So he talks about a zone of incompetence, which is really the stuff that like comes very hard to you and you shouldn't be doing because there's really very little passion or commercial possibility there. And then the zone of competence. So often in the zone of incompetence, I'll say, finance details are not my zone of competence. They're like completely not my thing. So I need someone else to knowledge translate for me and then get it done. Then there's the zone of competence, which is you can do it well, but there's also a lot of other people who can do the same thing. So in that space, I'd be like, okay, something like my ability to get involved in websites. Can I do it? Can I speak it better than most people? Yes. But would I make a living and be passionately involved there? No. And then the third, and this is where people get stuck, it's called the zone of excellence. It's what you're uncommonly good at and potentially what you've made a living out of for most of your life, right? And so you stay there because you're comfortable, you're good at it. And in my case, that might have been like writing. Like I made a living out of that for most of my life. And then finally is the zone of genius. That's the stuff that sings. You're like, it comes to you so easy. You get into a time warp when you're doing it. Like most people think it's very hard and you're like, oh, it was nothing. I woke up like this. That's your zone of genius. And the quest in life is to try and stay in that zone of genius. And it's not one thing at all times. And over life, I've realized my zone of genius is not in my writing. It's the fact that my writing solves your problems. And that shift, I think, was a big part of why I stay open to things. I enjoy it. Like, of course, like I said, I have an adventure streak in myself. If I see a hill, I'm jumping off it. Like, I'm just that person. But that said, it's this understanding of my innate abilities and then coming to terms with them that's been quite pivotal.
Say a little bit more about the idea of seeing patterns, because that was the part where I think I really jumped. That's something that I absolutely identify with. And it's hard to explain to people that don't see it that way. So it's probably like why Jim and I are fast friends, because we do. It's just like this, like you said, that zone of genius where there is no thought really in it. And oftentimes I find myself actually trying not to do it because I don't want to go down the path of already having created the solution, because my mind already starts to see the pattern.
LB, you're hitting right at something that I was about to chime in on. So when I process things, on the things that I know well, it's like a really good, a well-executed game of Tetris, because I'll see a couple of blocks and then I'll see the next 10 and I'm already at that stage. And I think where the gap in terms of my capability exists is that I will ask some questions on the front end and then it's off to the races. And by the time I get to where I want to get to, I look behind as everybody's like, where did Jim go? So the zone of excellence or genius is, in my particular area, it's the game of Tetris. I see the world as Tetris. And I see it before it happens in certain areas and I don't even notice it. So I have to like deliberately, just to LB's point, slow myself down in those areas so people don't get left behind.
Yeah.
You know, Susan, one of the things that when you and I got connected was this, it was from our podcasting experience. So I was just starting out, and the argument is that we're still just starting out because we're not even that well established in terms of our cadence. But one of the things that caught my attention, there was actually two. One was how you leverage long form content in terms of creating a content flywheel. And then the other one was your position in your newsletter about death to the hero story. And at the time that I read it, LB and I were primarily using that as our main format of the show. So tell us a little bit about your high level positions in both of those areas, and then we'll dig in a little bit on creating that evergreen content flywheel.
I'll start with the hero's journey and then we'll come back to the flywheel thing and continue that chat. I think the hero's journey, my statement there is specifically to do with going in the opposite direction of what everybody is doing. And with the hero's journey, I think when interviews were new, whether it was in TV or radio format, and advanced interviewers were asking beautifully constructed questions to paint a picture of someone's life versus the average business podcaster who in 20 minutes hasn't quite gotten to the point of the episode, that's where my rant lives. That is not the only format. Everybody's doing it. A lot of people are executing it not fantastically, like not in a way the reader or the listener has to sift through the material to get into the meat of it. So that was why the take on the death to the hero's journey, and then using that to spotlight the fact that there's so many other formats that do fantastically well. And one that I will usually go on about is panels. Like, I love it when people will get 3 or 4 people, break down the silos, whether it's your organization or across organizations. That when we were in events, we used to do that really well by the way of fireside chats and things. So 100% there's room for that. Do I have time for a beautifully told hero's journey? Yeah, of course. I love it. However, that is not the only format. So that's where my perspective comes on that. And as for flywheel, like, why is a podcast or like literally any long form content a flywheel content marketing strategy? The reason for it is that it takes a lot of time to start something new. And then when you keep approaching things ad hoc, like launch, repeat, you're just putting a lot of work without making it like ongoing. And I think people, whether it's imposter syndrome, whether it's lack of like full, what shall I say, bandwidth to execute some of these things, people just seem stuck on that wheel of not being able to move past that launch. That's when we were like, all right, with a podcast, here's what happens. You create, I call a minimum viable podcast product, like at least 25 episodes, which you have consistently released. Whether you pick a bi-weekly cadence or you pick a weekly cadence or even a monthly, if that's the best you can do, just pick something, do what you said you would and show up, right? That's the nature of binge-worthy content. It's your commitment to the audience that you will show up regularly on these days and bring this quality content. So I think when you put that sort of effort, like I would joke with my team about how we would release a podcast at 4 a.m. on Thursdays. It's called the 4 a.m. report. And we love staying true to a theme. 4 a.m. on Thursdays is not 4 a.m.-ish. It's not Thursday-ish. It's 4 a.m. on Thursday, because that kind of consistency is whether the people have heard the podcast or not, they'll see it out. And that's journalistic deadlines. And I feel like that's what creates that movement initially, because by virtue of doing that, you're automatically, if you have more than 7 episodes, you are in the top 7% of all podcasters, because most podcasts have less than 6 episodes. Somebody comes in, does a batch and leaves, right? So I think when you raise yourself in quality above that level, you're automatically in rarefied air. You're automatically the best of the best. And then how do you keep continuously improving? That's the whole point of the flywheel, is like, how do I now do less work and still have it publishing? How do you repurpose? Like, how do you pull out the videos from it? If you're only writing show notes, how do you also write a blog post from it? If you're writing one generalist blog post, can you break it up into 3 blog posts? So it's infinite. And after some time, like a 1-hour recording from me a week is now pretty much it. That's it. That I'll show up and do that, and all the rest of it works on its own. Can everyone do this? Yes, if you stay at it for 6 to 8 months.
I was actually going to ask is directly related to establishing the flywheel. I think that one of the things that we hope to do is share with others, right? So that they're able to pursue whatever their passions are or whatever it is that they want to do. And as you were talking about, I was listening to talk about the flywheel, and you talked quite a bit about the customers. When I think about the hero story, for example, we call the hero story the layout that we have. But the hero story for me is also, from a marketing standpoint, is really inserting our listeners into the story and that they are, in fact, the hero. And I think that you actually touched on that when you were talking earlier, right? How do you build toward that, towards centering whoever it is that your audience is going to be?
You talk to them to begin with. You're like, who do I want to reach out to? Am I speaking with an executive, mid-level marketing executive in this firm? You have to personify it. You have to be like me or like Jim, and then go have a chat with those folks. And sometimes I think marketers assume that talking to clients, somehow they're exempt from talking to clients. No, I think we need to start from there. Like, I myself regularly talk to, like, the place I'd start is existing clients. Like, right now, who do you have? Especially the people that have stayed with you, and ask them what makes you stay. Like, why did you originally come to us? Like, how did we? One of the things that we unearthed when asking those kind of questions early of our clients was that you folks are fun. And I was like, that's a bit of a weird thing to come up. Like, I understand, like, when we would get, you do what you said you would, which is like deadlines. We're pretty solid on deadlines, which I realize is not that common in the market. So that was a good thing. And then they would say we were fun. And I was like, I would never have positioned for myself in any way to do with fun. And I would never have gone forward to write a book called UnBoRiNg if not for the fact that I spoke to customers who pointed that out. And then we were like, all right, how can we be a little bit more tongue in cheek in everything that we do? How can we get a little bit more open about the fact that we have fun? And how can we, like, we through this like award ceremony called like Thirst Award. So we really started to lean into that part. And I think all of that comes from getting those customer insights, and you shine your beacon out into the world and people will find you. It sounds too idyllic, but I do believe that.
I want to call out one particular thing that you just mentioned, and this is something that just drives me insane. And I'm a sales guy, so I'm not even in the marketing world. So if it annoys me, I can't imagine how much it annoys like the really good marketers that are in my network. And it's this whole idea about enterprises developing customer personas without ever actually talking to a customer drives me nuts. Like, why would you do that? And again, it goes back to one of the earlier points that you mentioned. Our opinion of what we think is important to our customers is not important. It's actually the customer opinion of what's important to the customer what's important. So why in the world would you create a persona without ever talking to a customer? Sorry, rant over.
No, that's important. I want to drill down on that for a second. It's these assumptions that you're making and like ego. Let's be honest. Let's call it what it is. There's a level of ego, which is no, but this is the way in which it's always been done, or this is the way in which, we are most likely to, attract XYZ person. Maybe your customer is a completely different person. How about you go talk to them and find out? So I don't think I have any patience for people who don't get that done.
I think a lot of that comes from though. So this is my plug because somehow I'm always going to work DEI into conversations. But I think this is a great example of what that really is unconscious bias. We are going based off of our own assumptions of what we think people want. And so this is why Jim and I oftentimes talk about DEI being such a broader conversation, that if you're solving for this area over here, that's where unconscious bias is most likely attached to, is DEI. But Susan, what you just described is unconscious bias, where we sit back and what Jim said, I know what the customer needs, but that's based off what you think.
Yeah.
But what does the customer think? Have we asked? And I think it's also lazy. We fall back on what we've always done, which is, I think, the death of any sort of innovation. And you're looking for really reaching out to individuals. To that point, when you built the podcast initially, how did you start to hear from your customer, and how did you drive that conversation?
We practiced like that consistency that I would say is the first step. Now, the next part of it, and why I started to mention the fun, is that we really leaned into the fun. So oddly enough, it was the photos that came out of our podcast that seemed to attract people's attention. So it was called 4 a.m. Report. And so we had photos of Will and I doing these weird things that you would imagine people would do when they're up at night. So there was a photo of me in my robe eating Lay's dill pickled chips in front of my computer at night. And I have degrees in marketing. I have awards. I've done great work, but I'm best known for my picture with dill pickled chips.
So when this video comes out from the podcast, that face that I just made when I heard about your affinity for dill pickled chips is going to be a complete meme. Oh my God, that's horrible. Oh, I don't think this show's over.
No, this is a deal breaker.
It's hilarious. So Susan, you talked a little bit about the fun that you have, and it gave rise to your book, UnBoRiNg. What's that about?
So UnBoRiNg is about adding entertainment to your content. I think we've learned as a set of communicators how to do really well informing. We do a brilliant job of educating in our content, of putting forward great material, which gives you learnings. What might lack in some degree, especially noticeable after the pandemic, because people just need a little levity and a little lightness and a little kindness. I think people want you to make them smile, whether it's the prevalence of GIFs and memes, or whether it's the fact that people have gotten more comfortable getting like humorous in their writing, or look at us here, we're laughing through this podcast because we're having fun, and it's okay to show that to people. So that's the premise of the book, is like, how do you step away from those rules? So there's 10 lessons through the book about how to get less boring, how to perfect your timing. Most people, the resistance I would get to this is, oh, that's possible with all these big brands like Burger King and whatever, and it's not possible in the B2B space. I beg to differ. And the book has loads of examples on that. The way I got to that, if I may, is because of the podcast. We started asking people like, what keeps you up at night? And after we'd asked about 100 guests, what keeps you up at night? There were humorous answers in it. There was wit, there was self-deprecation, there was fun. And we were like, initially we said maybe the name of the book is The State of Sleeplessness. That's where we started. And then we realized there was a bit more of a Venn diagram sort of situation. And then in the middle there was this. So I wrote the book under the name of The Other EQ, but that sounded too cerebral. Again, going back to our theme, folks, I asked the people who will read the book, would you rather call it UnBoRiNg or would you rather call it The Other EQ? And 85% said I would rather call it UnBoRiNg. So I did.
I want to interject because I remember this happening on LinkedIn as you were going through the process, or I don't know what stage you were at, but it was not only that. Pick between this title or that title. This will give you a little bit of insight into how some Indians are. And by some Indians, I'm like this too. So Susan's question was, okay, now we've decided that the title of the book is going to be UnBoRiNg. So what's your vote on whether the U and the N should be capitalized or should the boring be capitalized or
Right.
some version of that?
Oh, yeah.
He
that's
actually
right.
set up a poll on LinkedIn to have people decide whether the un or the boring or the U and the N, like it was crazy.
Told you I see pattern, folks. That's my
Yep.
superpower. And also, I do practice what I preach. We ask the customer, for God's sake. So yeah, thank you for reminding me of that, Jim. I feel quite proud of myself now that
This all ties into is the whole concept of how do you build a brand? How do you have a point of view? All of these things are related. But I want to go back to something that you just said a few minutes ago, because you've introduced this in a couple of areas in the conversation where you're talking about, hey, the prevailing wisdom. And for those that are listening to this episode, I use prevailing wisdom and used air quotes. A lot of that prevailing wisdom is the whole idea that B2B has to be boring to boring is dumb.
nonsense. Yeah.
And what do we have to do to advance any sort of relationship with any other person? That we have to get to a point where they know you, right?
Correct.
So if you're this complete stiff going through life in any interaction, people aren't going to know you. They're probably not going to like you, and they certainly won't trust you. Let's be real. Bring your personality into it. And plot twist, I'm probably one of the stiffest people out in the world that is telling you to bring personality into your relationships. So get with it, people. Don't be boring.
I think Susan hit on some other brilliant elements too, is that, so when you think about COVID, what COVID caused was this whole virtual interconnectedness, and it allowed for us to start to see one another behind the veil. And what I heard as you were talking was you saw the pattern in the trends that were on social. For example, there were a litany of at least articles or posts that I saw about people saying they were pulling down their professional images and showing, I think there was one actually, and I can't remember the number. When I say viral, it was viral because I want to say it was like 500,000 interactions that this person had, but it was a woman who really took down her professional picture and put up her like just getting out of the shower, letting her hair dry or whatever. And so many people, like literally 500,000 people responded. It was something really incredible. I think it's brilliant though, that you saw the trend and saw that pattern, which is why kudos to ourselves because we can see patterns, but it's just brilliant. And I appreciate that it actually, the culmination was the book UnBoRiNg.
Thank you. And that's why when I talk about like the flywheel, it feels a little I didn't invent this. Like Jim Collins talked about something that was on a steam engine like 200 years ago. And then there was Rand Fishkin who came up with the idea of how you apply that into marketing. I'm just one of the believers in the fact that if you're going to do something, it has to be about momentum. Like I cannot stay in one place, whether it's my choice of where I live, how I do things, just static is not my thing. And so with a flywheel, I look back now 170 something episodes into our podcast. And I was like, how did we manage before this? Like we had a decent marketing plan, like we did stuff, but it just like, when I think about it, it's trying to think back to a life without a cell phone is how I would feel about living a life without one of these engines. If I didn't know that the following actions have to happen, and then out of this comes a blog, and then out of this comes that email, and then out of this comes 5 social posts, which I will snip it out and make notes about. And that's what fuels my entire LinkedIn presence. Like without that, like I wouldn't have been able to do it. And that's why so many people are not able to stick with it, because you're approaching it ad hoc. It's, come in one day, see how I feel about it. And then, okay, today I'm not feeling like it. Like, if I didn't have the podcast, there'd be many days I wouldn't have felt like it and it wouldn't have happened.
What you're describing is sort of the fundamental constraints that every organization and every individual deals with. You have limited time and resources, and you have limited energy to execute a given amount of tasks, and you're dealing with multiple priorities. So when you talk about the anchor content concept, you tied it to a couple of other things that you just mentioned. So let's break that down in detail. So you have anchor content, and then you talked about snippeting it out. You talked about a number of different steps. So in the interest of helping people be more efficient, helping people maximize the value that they have, give us sort of a roadmap of how you create that flywheel using the anchor content.
I like to say that there are 4 main formats of marketing content. There's written, there's audio, there's video, and then there's visual. And when I say visual, your infographics and your like checklists and playbooks and that sort of thing. So when you're anchoring, you anchor in one of these 4 formats. Pick a format. Are you a writer? Stick with writing. Are you a podcaster? Like you like the audio medium, head in that direction. So that's the anchor. Now, once you've done that, you have to flip it, snippet it out into all of the other formats. So that's the thinking behind it. So you've got this one large podcast or this one 30-minute webinar in video form. Like how do you take it and maximize it from a distribution perspective? Is that 5 videos? Is that 2 or 3 audiograms? Is that 10-second like stories? Like what is it? So that process of breaking it out into various formats, that's the short form of it. Now that's just scratching the surface. Like beyond that, like you get much more detailed if you want. One thing we've done with our podcast, in the beginning, we couldn't obviously afford to put as much effort into our own podcast as we were doing with others. So we didn't necessarily write a big long blog post for every single episode that we were recording. We would put some show notes together, release this, and instead we'd snippet it into shorter, shall we say, like quotes that we would pull out, etc. Then we started putting the transcript up because we were like, at least it's going to count from an SEO perspective, that's and an accessibility perspective, that if someone wants to read, they can read through it. So we started putting a little note there saying this is artificially generated, but for accessibility, it's available. Then came the third step, which was we got writers on the team, and then we started writing our own blog post. And now it's gotten to a point where from the same episode, different people will write different blog posts. Like I write my own, which is specifically that part about here's how to stay on track with podcasting. There's another one that's written about the writing series. There's somebody else who writes about something else. So you see how from that one piece, we've now extended out of it. We have a book, we have a video series, we have an award show. Did this happen in 1 year? No, it took 3 years. But we're never really off course. Like it's just the next step, the next circle of that wheel, and it keeps moving.
You talked about this a little bit, but for the novice, what would you say would be like the initial way to organize? I love what you said, and I think that we are patting on the back. So if you can't see us, I think we're following a lot of what you're saying. I feel good about that. But if you're brand spanking new and someone's thinking about it, because Jim has said this a couple of times, right? That it's not only about but an individual, right, that's interested in cultivating their brand could do this as well.
100%. So the first step is audit. Whoever you are, you've probably got some material of some sort. You've probably either authored something, maybe you've done something through the role that you were in previously. Maybe you were on other people's podcasts, where you've talked about something. Maybe there's a bunch of content that you've commented on LinkedIn and made some excellent points. So I think the first step is to just go look at all of that. And again, try to see if there's a pattern. So you start with that. Then I think you need to, and this is not an absolute answer, but I think you need to get clear about what your key messaging is. Like at least narrow it down to 2 to 3 pillars. And you bring that further and further down after. But I don't think you can be talking about too many things. Like I'm very tempted on some occasions to be like, I want to talk about this and I also want to talk about this. And I've got a whole lot of material on UX writing, but I don't pull it out all the time and publish because I'm like, focus, just get really narrow about those 2 to 3 pillars. So I think that would be the next step. And then really getting familiar with what is that format. You don't have to do something where there's friction. If you hate video, like that's not the only way to get like regularly communicating. Find a different way. If you don't like the sound of your own voice and you don't have someone like my partner, Will Lamont, to hold your hand and take you through that, don't do podcasts. Find something else that you like better. If you're a great teacher and everyone's telling you webinars are dead, maybe they're not dead for you. Find the format, I think, medium that is like your favorite. And then after that, it's all in the execution. I think discipline, it doesn't sound sexy to a lot of people, but you got to have the discipline. It's like every Tuesday we send out an email, like every Wednesday we publish on the blog, every Thursday the blog post comes out. If we didn't have that kind of core regimented discipline, it wouldn't happen.
I wanted to call out, though, that when you talk about that discipline and how important it is, the upside too is that the UX content that you have a passion for also allows for a pivot. So it's the ability to continue doing what you're doing, but just in another vertical, not very far away. And I have conversations with folks about the idea, like they have all these ideas, and I'm always trying to help them to bring them back so that when they have to pivot, let's say you've mastered one area, like you don't go from learning how to ride a bike to driving in NASCAR, right? So I love the idea of not shying away from having content, but just being disciplined enough not to just spackle everything out there.
There's 2 things that caught my attention when you were talking, Susan. One is in line with what we just pointed out about the discipline concept. But I think one of the areas where a lot of people confuse the discipline element of it is that, if I do it once a month or whatever, some sort of long span between instances. I think when we're looking at getting to the zone of genius, you have to have pig-headed discipline to execute the task on a daily basis, in my opinion, because that's the only way that you'll iterate to the point where you're at the level where it's autopilot. But the other thing that's interesting about your pivoting comment, or at least your ideas on pivoting, is that when you look at all the skills that a person has and a mainstream of content that they put out, those sub areas that aren't quote unquote on brand, but you're interested in, offer an opportunity for pattern interruption in the minds of the people that are actually consuming your content. So that way they don't get dulled to, here's Susan with the same thing again. Yes. And you see this pop of, Susan knows about UX, because your consumers change all the time. So you have to deliberately, in addition to being disciplined, you have to deliberately insert pattern interruption into your cadence so that you're keeping things fresh in the minds of your consumer. You can be deliberate about that effort and identify areas. Hey, I want to get better at this thing, so let me just start doing it and using that as a pattern interruption in my cadence to drive content out in the world.
I think essentially, again, it's a little bit about focus. You do have to figure out within that pattern interrupt as well what it is you want to be creating as a message, right? Like in my case, why do we have those pieces around UX and we also have pieces around certain other kinds of specific writing is because they are associated factors to our line of business, to the core craft that many of us on the team have, and like things like that. So as far as I'm concerned, I think it's a thoughtful process. If you look at like LinkedIn and its creator tools, like they tell you to say, what are the 4 or 5 things that you stand for? And within that, sure, you can say marketing, content marketing, blah, blah. This is not a keyword exercise. This is an area of expertise. So in my case, and LB, you'll appreciate this from the mention of I take everything back to a DEI context, is like my other podcast, which I run with my very awesome long-term friend and colleague, is a podcast called ABC DEI. And that podcast is a top 5% global podcast. And right now I love working on that. And people ask me, what's the connection? Are you a DEI practitioner? Are you a consultant? I've even been asked by like bankers and such, what is your body of work with DEI? Well, my body of work is my lived experience and the fact that I could be talking about any number of things. I could be talking about my love of beautiful backgrounds. I could be talking about my love of equipment. But instead, my pattern interrupt is I choose to talk about inclusive communication on the regular. Like I choose to show up every Friday and do this as a labor of love. That's how I think about it, Jim. The way I think about it is it has to be a thoughtful process of your pattern interrupt is also core to your key messaging and your overall foundation.
We talk often on the show about the concept and practice of intentionality. So that is really where it ties in.
Susan, you have shared and dropped tons of information for us and for our audience to actually take in and move our careers further, faster. What are the key takeaways? And I don't think it's going to be 15. It's just 2 or 3 key takeaways.
I'd say the key takeaways that I'd like you to leave with is really thinking about your natural sort of areas. It sounds a little woo-woo. There's a lot of practice that you can attach to it, but get really clear about what you're good at, or even if you start from the negative, what you're not so good at, and start from there. Secondly, you definitely want to remember that in 2022, there's very few people without a body of work. So look at the pattern in front of you, like what have you had success executing before? Talk to your customers, get proper intel before you make a plan. And then the third thing is I think you should definitely stay on track, like no ad hoc and out. Give it some cadence, some consistency and discipline. And that usually tends to take you to that execution that you need in order to have some impact.
Thank you. And where can folks find you? I know that I've actually seen you frequently on TikTok, but what are the other places that people can get in contact with you?
I spend an unhealthy amount of time on LinkedIn and TikTok. But yes, that would be a great place to find me. Our website is cp.digital, and we have loads of podcasting resources there that you're welcome to check out.
Susan, thank you for joining us on Cascading Leadership, the show. As you are also on TikTok, we are too. We're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So those are the places that folks will want to check us out to find out when other episodes will drop. But I'm really looking forward to folks listening to this episode and giving us feedback and telling us stories about how they will advance their own opportunities to start their own podcast. We're all here for it. And so thank you again so much for joining Cascading Leadership, the show.
Thank you for having me. This is a pleasure.
Thanks, Susan. Great show.